even have heard about Moscow.
In 2016, the Panama Papers shocked the world with the tax haven secrets.
$2 trillion United States dollars passed through Mossack Fonseca in the amount of time that we've been in the Panama Papers exposure. That's what it shows. It's a lot of money.
It really is journalism. It's an act of journalism, looking at things that people wanted to keep secret and asking why would they want to keep these things secret.
Millions of Mossack Fonseca documents were examined.
The only people which basically have tried to get an advantage out of this story were newspaper and probably other politicians which were attacking other politicians.
The media were quick to find their targets, such as the kings of Morocco and Saudi Arabia, the president of Argentina, several prime ministers, and Russian President Vladimir Putin, of course.
Oh my God, I have sued so many newspapers for defamation.
Some things don't just happen by chance.
It was very striking there were no Americans in the list, especially, but a lot of people from the BRICS countries, especially Brazil, Russia, and China.
This special project reveals what was missed in the media coverage. The Panama Chronicles.
Los Angeles, the city of luxury and fame, but also an alarming number of people living in the streets.
The simple fact in LA is there's just not enough shelter. Even if people on the streets right now decided to come in, there's nowhere to come in.
It's been a struggle, but I'm hanging in there.
This man found his own response to the problem and constructed dozens of tiny homes for people in need of shelter.
When you have nothing and nowhere to go, having something like this may as well be a castle.
But do the authorities accept such a solution?
A tiny house on a city parking space is not a solution. You have to have someone monitoring the site. Otherwise, it'll be a free-for-all.
And is there a better alternative to end the homelessness crisis?
Welcome back. It's 72 hours since hundreds of Day of Rage protesters marched on Britain's Parliament in the shadow of the tragic, some say emblematic, inferno at Grenfell Tower here in Kensington in London. But as grief turns to anger at Theresa May's post-election chaos and lack of transparency from local councils and private developers, how did Margaret Thatcher to New Labour lay the foundations on which the housing crisis is constructed today? Here's Going Underground's senior producer Pete Bennett at the screening of a new documentary, Dispossession: The Great Social Housing Swindle, to talk with key figures in what they consider a class war against social cleansing.
Since the early 1980s, people living in UK social housing has dropped from 42% to less than 8%, with an estimated 1.4 million currently on the council's waiting lists. And yet, despite rising property prices and the growing demand for affordable homes, successive governments have slashed investment in social housing, just as councils sell off whole estates to private developers. Asian Dennis lives on southeast London's Aylesbury estate, the site of a controversial regeneration scheme in which residents have been forcefully rehoused.
People are being sent out of to London, and especially elderly people, which they grow up their children, all their networks around here. They've been offered, some other towns outside of London, and council is so brutal towards us because this is a class division. They are after middle class people. They don't care about the class, the working class people. We know that, we established that, so we do not expect anything, and I know them. They are the hidden Tories.
Well, from New Labour to the current opposition, I asked grassroots activist and Defend Council Housing member Fred Milton how Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto fares ahead of the upcoming Grenfell Tower inquiry.
Of course, Jeremy Corbyn's initial promise to build 500,000 council housing in 5 years was very welcome. But I have to say that in the course of the election, that was watered down. What these recent events on Grenfell Tower proves is that we need council housing. We need council housing run by responsible managers, not outsourced by the councils, but actually as a core function of the council to actually run their housing properly, and that means keeping them safe.
But how is this allowed to happen in the first place? I spoke to Green London Assembly member and Camden councillor for Highgate, Sian Berry, about the causes of the housing crisis.
The ultimate cause is capitalism. The market in housing has been unregulated and deregulated for far too long. We are seeing rising costs. We're seeing lots of problems with people buying homes simply to rent them out. They're distorting the market. And the big developers' business model really is failing London. We're seeing lots of homes that are built, no Londoner could ever afford to buy. Those of us that can just about scrape enough to rent then further damage our chances of buying. It's genuinely broken. And even where you've got powers, like you've got the Mayor Sadiq Khan, he's rowing back on some of his promises to people on estates, to renters, when it comes to things like rent controls and having a vote on whether or not your home is demolished.
However, the crisis goes beyond the capital to communities across the UK. Kevin Doody grew up in Scotland's Gorbals on a housing estate that he says has been ignored by power, but given a voice by films like Dispossession, the great social housing swindle.
What can the people of the Gorbals in Glasgow and the people that you're going to see in this film, what can they offer the Tory party? Nothing. And the Tory party know that. They don't care. Boris Johnson doesn't care. Theresa May doesn't care. All the Michael Gove, the ones that she's brought on board as if they care, as if they're going to make a difference. It's not going to make a difference. It's going to be the same. It's perpetual selfishness, self-centeredness, not care for anyone else. If you actually think that the Tory party in this country believe in social housing, they don't even believe in society. Margaret Thatcher said there is no society, there's only people. This is not just a movie. This is Ken Loach. This is Dennis Potter. This is the Boys from the Black Stuff. This is a sign of the times. This is a shout. Boom. Creativity, documentaries, film, camera. Get it on, people. Get out there. Tell the truth what's happening in this country. Put it on the screen.
Expressing the human cost of the housing crisis on the big screen, this documentary explores the catastrophic failures that have led to a chronic shortage of social housing in Britain.
Essentially, we've had successive governments that simply haven't seen the role for social housing, and they've been cutting it.
Senior producer Pete Bennett there. I'm outside the Grenfell Tower in North Kensington in London now with the director of Dispossession, the great social housing swindle, Paul. First of all, just your reaction to be here. Lots of the mainstream media cameras not here anymore.
Looking at the building, obviously you can't really comprehend what went on in there. When I found out about it, I was in Sheffield, and I remember seeing the images on TV, and initially, like most people, you just feel sympathy and empathy for the people that it's affected, and then afterwards, shock and anger at the fact that it had been allowed to happen. I think there were a dozen council inspections of that building, and seeing this all come out in the last few days, it just draws you back to systematic neglect, not only of people in council housing, but of working class people, of poor people, of vulnerable people all over the UK. The thing I keep going back to is the 70-odd Tory MPs that voted against the landlord bill to make homes fit for human habitation, and I think that this terrible incident just raises more questions and more anger about why we have a government, why we have a system of parliament that isn't representative of people.
Let's go to the film, because of course again and again, even just after the aftermath of Grenfell, when the fire was still raging, we were told not to politicise it. Why was the Conservative and Labour policy of right to buy so popular, and yet so much part of the current housing crisis in Britain?
I think it was popular because, working class people like anyone else wanted to own their own homes, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to own your own home. It's a desire that goes back, years and years and years. And so the right to buy, in principle, wasn't a bad idea. But the problem was they didn't replace like for like. I think Thatcher said that they would, replace 2 for every 1. They didn't even do 1 for 1. And so, that goes into the Blair and Brown administrations as well. In the combined period of 13 years of New Labour, they built fewer houses in total than Thatcher's government averaged every year. So it's an issue across both parties, and it's a policy now that I think needs to end, because we do have a housing shortage. We do have problems with council housing, but continuing to sell off that stock and not replace it is just senseless.
And you tackle the issue of Labour councils up and down the country blaming not their councillors, but blaming central government for cuts in housing stocks.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's very easy to blame central government and say this all comes, down from the state, but local authorities do have to be a bit smarter. Obviously their budgets have really been cut to the bone, but announcing things, as in the case of Lambeth Council, where they announced the demolition of Cressingham Gardens on Twitter, that's not very clever, is it? That's actually deeply insensitive. It's actually offensive. So, not only do councils have to communicate better, but they need to explain why they're doing these redevelopments. And, working with property developers is always a very murky area, because at the bottom line for a property developer is profit.
But why do you think issues like, say, subsidised mortgages as a way to make housing more equitable gets common currency in media, and yet in your film it comes out as all it does is to make housing more unaffordable?
Council housing did used to be a permanent, safe, secure home. In the 50s and 60s, my family, when they got council housing, they were proud of it. They lived in it. They knew it was their home for life. But the problem is now, with the Housing and Planning Act, there are going to be no more, lifetime tenancies.
You say in the film that when a person dies in social housing, it's a requirement? So is that to just sell it on to the private sector?
That will be, that's part of the new Housing and Planning
We're not
Act.
sure, obviously, whether that's going to be the case here.
Jamie Burton, a solicitor from Doughty Street Chambers who appears in the film, is of the view that a lot of that policy may or may not actually be enforced. There are still campaigns to try and repeal that act. So I think we're still in very early days, but what it can do in principle is bad enough, I think.
But in the film, you talk about social stigma a bit like in Rio's favelas. People don't admit to living in social housing so polarised is class in Britain today.
Yeah, there's a lot of stigmatisation around it, and that comes from the media, it comes from TV programmes, poverty porn shows, where council tenants are depicted as on benefits, they're depicted as somehow undeserving, as stupid, and that's not the case. Some of our brightest minds and people came from council housing. Tower blocks are not evil. It's actually, the social problems that are created by a society, by a system of government, that are the problem.
But when it comes to who the government listens to in your film, it appears that, you allege, very, very rich estate agencies recommend to the government policies like destroying 400,000 special housing homes, and the government listens to reports coming from estate agents that will win from that policy.
Yeah, I think there was a report from Savills that came out, and I think they put a figure on someone's worth in London, and I think you've got to be earning about £70,000 to be worth your spot in London. That was the average figure, and I don't know too many people that earn that much money. And so what you have then is the colonisation of space. You have the idea that to be in this city you have to justify your place here by earning a certain amount of money, which means you can afford to pay a certain amount of rent or mortgage, and then also spend this much on what is the London economy. And that's just, it's nonsense, isn't it?
Well, your film outlines how areas are socially cleansed. Initially, we heard that there would be rehousing of the survivors of the Grenfell tragedy. The latest, I think, is, Theresa May said in London. Now she's saying boroughs or neighbouring boroughs. How do you think policymakers are going to? We have to hold them to account.
They've moved some residents into some nearby luxury apartments, which have like a concierge service, which have a gymnasium, and it's important that the people that move into that property get those services too. Whether they're in a separate section, I don't know. I think they will. It has been now confirmed they'll be in a separate
area of so-called affordable housing. Just describe what a poor door is.
Yeah, so I mean, a poor door is an annex to luxury apartments, which is where the social rent tenants leave and enter. There are all sorts of reasons for that are used to justify it. Part of the agreement with the builder is that they'll only make a certain amount of social rents available if there is a separate gate and entrance. It also reduces the cost down for everybody. So you can argue it economically that, you know, there is a reason for it. But then on the other side of it, you can look at it as being a systematic, you know, microcosm of our society, that the rich go in one way, the poor leave another way. And then you've got, you know, two people that were in the press complaining about the price of property, complaining about how they'd worked so hard and now they were going to have to mix with, you know, all of these, you know, working class people. You know, I despair at that. You really despair, and it just shows you where we've got to, or where we've sunk to as a society, because, you know, we're all culpable in this. As a society, we all need to actually, you know, take responsibility, and if we don't have those views, challenge those views.
And that's it for one of your favourite shows of this season. We'll be back with all new episodes of Going Underground on Wednesday, the 17th of January. Till then, keep in touch via social media. Have a happy Yuletide.
In some American cities, the police have built themselves quite a reputation.
People who walk on the streets of the United States are at risk from the very people who are supposed to protect them.
People are now more afraid of police than of criminals.
You can see something happening and you're just like, I don't want to call the cops. Let that happen rather than call the cops and then those young black men lose their lives.
Chasing the unarmed with their fingers on the trigger.
You never know. Better safe than sorry. I don't know that someone else isn't going to pull a gun out. So, yeah, unfortunately, around here, we end up pulling our guns a lot.
The death toll from such precautions is 2 black men a week.
Раз. Колени за себя вытянули и поднимаем. Потому что отвалилось назад. На ножке стоять надо. Вперед поставили.
Каменева нет, Петухова нет, Маргулец нет, Баршева нет.
Остальные девочки приглашаются на второй тур.
Кровь, да, мозоли, мясо. Мясо, да, мозоли до мяса.
Шаг, раз, два, дал руку. И ты сама идешь, понимаешь? Не стыдно? Ты первый раз на сцене?
Это сказка только с той стороны оркестровой ямы.
When old truths seem wrong, when old rules just don't hold, and a new world is yet to shape out, disdain becomes the etiquette, and engagement equals betrayal. When so many find themselves worlds apart, we choose to look for common ground.
In the news from our Start International today, a factory worker in Moscow kills an on-site security guard earlier over a row of a bankruptcy. A police hunt for the gunman is still underway this afternoon. German authorities identify a large network of women spreading Islamic State ideology online, with officials warning today that the wives of killed ISIL fighters are now more effective at spreading the group's message of hate. Hope to bring you a live update on that. And thousands of documents relating to controversial episodes in British history have gone missing again, this new in, with the country's National Archives claiming that civil servants simply misplaced them again. Hope to get you a live update on it too. Busy half-hour news coming up, 6 p.m. here in Moscow. Welcome. My name's Kevin Owen. We start with this then. Police in Moscow say that a factory director who shot dead a security guard earlier today is still on the run. It's following a full search of the factory's premises in the last couple of hours, which are located in the southeast of the Russian capital. Police say they're now widening the search area to the whole of Moscow in an attempt to try to apprehend this gunman, whose photo you can see on your screens. It's understood that the situation escalated into a gunfight after a row over looming bankruptcy proceedings. The suspect reportedly claims he's been defrauded of his shareholding in the company. Wrapping up, Medina Kochneva reporting from outside the factory.
The shooting took place this Wednesday morning at one of the confectionery factories located in the southeast of the capital. As we understand, the gunman is the director of the factory who came this morning to work and saw bailiffs operating inside, as the factory has quite a substantial debt. Now, after a conflict that they had, the director of the factory opened fire at the bailiffs, but they managed to run away and barricaded themselves in one of the areas of the factory. He was then confronted by a security guard of the factory, and he shot the security guard, who later died at the scene. Business FM radio station managed to talk to the director of the factory, and he said that he was deprived of his factory, that there is a fake bankruptcy case opened against him, and that he's been struggling for years.
I'm the director. I've barricaded myself in. My company was taken away by forged documents. I was robbed blind. I will fight to the end if I stay alive. Now I'm surrounded by special operations forces. All fine. Now I'll either shoot myself or surrender.
Now, the area is cordoned off, and we know that the gunman is at large, and the police has launched a search operation.
After the fall of Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, more tales of horror are emerging of life under the terrorist rule. Kurdish minority families in Iraq, known as Yazidis, suffered capture, death or enslavement. Our senior correspondent Murad Gazdiev has been speaking with some of those families who managed to survive the ordeal. I can tell you, just to tip off, we're showing you the full interviews Thursday, but here's some of what is to come.
We were captured. We spent 2 months in Iraq, then we were taken to Syria. They made me a slave. We were put to work and held where the troops were. We were given 1 hour a day to rest, then I ran away. They caught me and locked me in a toilet for 3 days without food or water. I tried to escape again and again, but each time I was caught, beaten and severely tortured. They shot my friends. We begged them for mercy on our knees. Then we were hit by an airstrike and I was concussed. My head still hurts. I can't talk for long. I was pregnant, but I was so terrified that I lost my child. My husband and family were captured. I was left alone with my mother. So I took poison. I decided it was better to die. When they caught me, I thought that since my family, my husband, and my house were gone, it would be better to die.
In 2014, up to 10,000 Yazidis were killed or kidnapped by ISIL in just a matter of days. Of those, a third were executed. But the true scale of the tragedy may never be fully known. The testimonies that have emerged suggest that many were tortured, beheaded, or even burned alive. In many cases, entire families were wiped out completely. Women and girls often sold as sex slaves, while young boys were forced to become ISIL fighters. Some weren't even old enough for school when they were forced to serve the terrorists.
My daughter was 5 years old when she was captured. 4 years have passed since then, so she is 9. We endured a lot of suffering. My brother escaped, and I stayed at his place. Then he died in Sinjar. I was desperate after his death, and I went to stay with my other brother. He is poor and has young children, all girls.
Developing story this afternoon, the German security services have identified a female terror network aggressively spreading Islamist ideology online. Let's cross to Berlin. RT's Maria Finoshna is there. Hi. How serious is this situation regarding ISIL recruitment in Europe now?
Well, it's not for the first time that we see women actively involved in promoting jihadist views, but Germany says that their number is on a constant dramatic rise. This is what they have to say.
The women are now ideology promoters. The men have realized that women can network much better and are therefore more capable of expanding the scene.
In this recent case, Germany says it identified what they called the Islamic terrorist women's network, consisting of at least 40 what they call sisters who follow the ultra-conservative branch of Islam known as Salafism and spread extremist views via internet, particularly targeting so-called non-believers. The German authorities stress that it would be wrong to equal Salafism to terrorism. But at the same time, they add that it could be potential breeding for terrorists. All over Europe, including here in Germany, especially following last year's Berlin terror attack, Christmas has sadly become the time for extra concerns over security, because Christians and their faith and their holidays and their festivities and everything that is connected to it, including Christmas markets that are currently open and will be open for the next week all over Europe, have been repeatedly targeted by Islamists because they consider them being part of infidel culture. This is why it has been quite bad for quite some time already, we can say, but fears are now increasing with a number of those who share Salafi views rose to all-time high, according to Germany's intelligence agency. They connect it with ISIS dramatic losses in the Middle East, and now they say that the number of returnees is on a constant rise, and with the so-called Islamic State defeat in Syria and Iraq, the European security is as fragile as never before.
Yeah, it's been warned about for so long, the returnees. Now there's other twisted as well about the wives of these people. Okay, Maria, thanks for the update there. Appreciate it. Story next from Russia. It seems Russia is suffering a severe HIV epidemic. In terms of infections every year, Russia now is third behind only South Africa and Nigeria. Making matters worse is the emergence of people here in Russia who deny the disease even exists. Ilya Petrenko reports.
HIV epidemic is sweeping across Russia. According to health experts, more than 1 million Russians are infected.
Almost 1 in 100 people in Russia are diagnosed HIV positive. Despite a year of increased efforts to tackle the spread of the virus, the country is on course to see annual infections pass 100,000 again, which accounts for almost 2/3 of all infections in Europe and Central Asia.
World AIDS Day saw quite a few depressing headlines in Russian, like Russia's losing the war on HIV. In most countries around the world, the number of new cases of HIV is going down. The sad truth is, here, it's going up. I went to see the country's top HIV prevention researcher to find out what was going wrong.
I'm about to enter a lab where the staff work with samples from people diagnosed with HIV and who say there is no defeating the virus without their work.
For quite a long time, 5 years, not nearly enough attention has been paid to the issue of HIV/AIDS. There has not been enough funding.
The war on HIV requires decisive action. Without it, this academic told me, the virus spreads far beyond the two main so-called risk groups, drug users and men who have sex with men.
We've lost time, that's for sure.
While health authorities were losing time, people known as AIDS denialists wasted none online, spreading fake HIV news.
On Russian social networks, in blogs and elsewhere online, AIDS denialists are clearly ahead of us, and that's really dangerous. If you refuse therapy, an early death is guaranteed.
We started looking for denialists who were willing to share their thoughts with us. Finding their social network communities, which have thousands of members, was easy, but arranging an interview required over a week. Finally, one woman who used to refuse therapy, a choice that almost cost her life, agreed to talk on condition of anonymity. She asked to be called Yelena. The ex-AIDS denialist struggled to maintain her composure as she recalled how she was diagnosed with HIV.
Вообще что-то такое происходило, знаете, как в тумане. И такое было ощущение, что жизнь останавливается, да, то есть и здоровье, и тут еще такое сообщает, естественно, никакого будущего впереди я не видела.
Yelena's initial treatment had put her health back on track until she met a man who introduced her to the online world of AIDS denial. Vadim eventually convinced her to give up HIV treatment. Her desire to get rid of the stigma prevailed over common sense.
Я даже не могу понять, как я на это решилась. Вот сейчас я бы никогда в жизни не решилась на этот шаг. Даже помню слова врача. Она мне сказала, ты же потом приползешь к нам.
And a couple of years later, after wild ups and downs in health, she did just that, with a form of cancer.
У меня поднялась температура до 39, у меня очень сильно болел живот, я практически не могла ходить. Я поняла причину всего происходящего, я поняла, что это все из-за того, что действительно вирус есть.
А что произошло с тем человеком, который вас на это натолкнул?
Он умер тоже от лимфомы. Да, он признал, что он был неправ, он так и написал, да, что я был дурак, вот, но уже было поздно.
After several rounds of surgery, chemotherapy, and renewed HIV treatment, Yelena managed to survive. Unbelievably, she was then bullied online by the denialists for taking medicine again. But Yelena says she can put all that behind her, hoping that in a country with a worsening HIV problem, her story could help others avoid fatal mistakes. Ilya Petrenko, RT.
Thousands of documents relating to controversial episodes in British history appear to have gone missing. The UK's National Archives claim they were misplaced or removed by civil servants, which doesn't sound too careful. Let's see what Polly Boyker's got on this in London. Hi, Polly. Yeah, what kind of documents are we talking about here? Surely these were something that should be looked after carefully, but they've disappeared. A lot of questions. Let's answer some.
Look, the National Archive is a very important resource here, especially for people like historians and for journalists. It looks after the most important papers relating to the history of the country. And the idea is a perfectly transparent system. So once these government files are declassified, anyone over the age of 16 should be able to go there and to access them. But not all of them, it turns out. Some of the files relating to thornier chapters of British history, shall we say, appear to be missing. Now, among the missing files, there are papers relating to the Falklands War, there are documents relating to the Northern Ireland troubles, and perhaps most controversially, files relating to a very famous case called the Zinoviev letter. That was way back in 1924. They appear to be missing. Now, this was a huge political scandal at the time because MI6 almost certainly forged a letter that was leaked to the press that discredited the Labour government at the time and resulted in its ultimate downfall. Now, all the missing files are listed as misplaced while on loan to a government department. So we've got a situation where there are a number of different government departments under pressure to explain why they have taken these bits of paper, but they have failed to give them back. Now, we've asked for a comment from the Home Office over that Zinoviev letter. We've had no response as yet from them. We have, however, heard from the Foreign Office. Now, the Foreign Office had misplaced Bulgarian dissident journalist over on Waterloo Bridge, not too far from where I'm sitting. Now, this is what the Foreign Office had to say about that missing file. Take a listen.
17 out of 19 documents have been recovered, and we are sending them back to the National Archives. We're still searching for the 2 documents that have not yet been accounted for.
So an explanation there, and clearly efforts being made to, shall we say, correct what has happened, because the public here has a right to access these documents, these chapters of British history, rather than finding that they have been misplaced, and according to some, perhaps a little too conveniently. Now, the opposition Labour Party here has called for an investigation into the missing documents. Otherwise, they say there'll be allegations of a cover-up in relation to this, while human rights groups like Amnesty International, like Reprieve, they use these archives quite often to search for evidence of human rights violations. They're now demanding that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, that she launch a search for these missing documents across all the government departments that have failed to return them to the National Archive.
All right, Polly, thanks for telling us about that. RT's Polly Boyker in London. We're staying in London too to get some more thoughts on it. We're joined live by international affairs commentator Jonathan Steele. Hey, Jonathan, you've been listening in. I know you've been across this. Is it just an unfortunate coincidence that some of these highly controversial papers belonging to highly controversial cases have just gone missing? Was it careless? Or was it more to it than that, do you think?
I think there's more to it than that. I mean, if you lose one or two documents, that could be just a mistake, human error by somebody innocently making a mistake. But if large numbers, more than 1,000 documents have got lost, and most of them seem to refer to very controversial cases, then you have to begin to smell a rat.
Do you think these papers will now come to light? I mean, there's a call for it. We've put in a request. The Prime Minister's going to be asked. Do you think they will all come to light, or have they been lost for good, some of these?
Well, it's impossible to say. You can't answer that question 100%. We'll just have to see over the next few days and weeks whether they do come to light again. But it is an absolute scandal because, as you pointed out, most of them refer to incidents in the past where Britain was in a very bad position. There was a question of torture in Northern Ireland. There was an obvious letter. I mean, interestingly, when it's a time when we're talking about fake news being used to tamper with elections, all kinds of allegations being made. Here's a case where British intelligence definitely did tamper with an election in 1924, and there's no doubt about it, but we haven't got the evidence that was once available has now gone missing.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think if the UK's National Archives have documents, you think maybe they'd almost, especially if they're important documents, you'd think they would maybe keep duplicates, or is that wishful thinking? I don't know how it works.
Well, that's another of the questions that's being asked. Did you keep documents? Did you make copies? Did you make duplications? Where are the duplications? Why didn't you then send the originals back if you were making a copy? Why didn't the government department send it back to the National Archives where they belong if they borrowed them just on a temporary basis? So there are a whole series of questions that need to be answered.
Where should the heads roll here, do you think? UK National Archives or the departments to where they've gone and been lost?
I think it's the government departments. I mean, the National Archives perhaps should never have lent them out without better safeguards that they'd be returned within a short space of time. But the government has the ultimate power, and they can order the National Archives to lend material to them. So they're the ones who should take the blame for this, not the National Archive people themselves.
I wonder it'll bring in the call, I suppose, as well in the future for more of this stuff to be digitised as well as being physically there in paper, to be put on some sort of digital record, I guess, in future, yeah?
Well, it's always easy to wipe computers too, and so just putting them on a digital thing doesn't safeguard them forever. If there's ill will, people will find a way to destroy things, unfortunately.
Real mystery, isn't it? Jonathan Steele, international affairs commentator, thanks. We're across the story. We'll continue to follow it up, and thanks for your input too. Other news, the largest exchange of prisoners of war between Ukraine and the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk republics has just been completed. We're here today. We'll get live update on that after this break. Here's
what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
He doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, send us an email.
President Donald Trump's 2017 National Security Strategy report tells us how he sees the world, or rather, how the Washington foreign policy leads do. Clearly, Washington's neocons are running the show.
Wednesday, the 27th of December. Thanks for watching RT International live from Moscow. It's coming to 22 minutes past 6 Moscow time now. The North African country of Tunisia has demanded an apology from the United Arab Emirates. This spat going on. It's after Emirates Airlines banned female Tunisians from boarding flights to the UAE last Friday, citing a possible terrorist threat. The move caused widespread anger.
Why would I go to a country that won't accept me? If that's the case, then we should also impose visas on the United Arab Emirates.
These operations are a farce. Preventing an Arab from visiting Arab countries is unacceptable when we see Westerners going from country to country freely. The Tunisian state must defend the rights of Tunisian women and force the UAE to apologize.
The passenger ban, has to be said, was lifted the same day, and the Gulf state's foreign minister later tweeted that the ban had been necessary for security, he said, stressing, though, that the UAE respects and values Tunisian women. But that was not enough for Tunisia. It retaliated by banning all Emirates flights now from landing in its airports. This tweet you're seeing was posted by the airline informing customers that flights indeed had been suspended. We talked to a Tunisian blogger and activist who said the UAE's initial passenger ban was a big insult.
Consider that what happened is a violation of Tunisian women's rights, but it's a violation of women's rights in general. The spokesperson for the Tunisian presidency talked about security problems, but this doesn't justify what happened. Even small female babies were not allowed to go on planes. I don't think that a toddler is or can present a danger. The Tunisian government is still asking for official apology, and it happened under the pressure of people here in Tunisia.
A major prisoner exchange between Kiev and the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk republics in East Ukraine is apparently just finished. It's the largest since the start of the conflict. RT's Roman Kostrov's there. Just witnessed it all. How did it go? How many people were involved? Take us through it.
Well, that's right, Kevin. This is the largest prisoner exchange that's taken place here in the east of Ukraine since the start of the conflict back in 2014. 74 Ukrainian soldiers were sent back home on this day from Donetsk and Lugansk, as promised by the side here, while 306 were supposed to return here to Donbass. However, that figure has changed at the very end with the Ukrainian authorities claiming that some of the captives had already been released earlier, and some of the captives have refused to return to Donetsk and Lugansk. Once again, this is according to the Ukrainian authorities, and this is something that remains to be confirmed. So the final number of prisoners of war that returned to Donetsk and Lugansk stands right now at 240 people. However, not everything went completely smoothly during the exchange, as the Ukrainian side delayed the exchange by not closing closing the checkpoint where this exchange was supposed to take place. Of course, this prisoner swap is a part of the Minsk agreements, and of course the Minsk agreements have been designed to help settle the conflict here in the east of Ukraine, and the prisoner exchange is a major part of it, as it's the humanitarian part. Well, the rest of it remains to be decided a little bit later. Meanwhile, the prisoners that have been exchanged will be spending the New Year holidays with their families, both in Ukraine and here in these contested territories.
I was going to say, no matter how you look at it, at least some people will be back with their friends, families and loved ones tonight, this festive period coming up to the New Year. Thanks, Roman. You take care. Have a good New Year yourself. Thanks for telling us about that. Well, talking of this festive period, New Year period, seems the French president isn't letting everyone have a holiday. He surprised his ministers by demanding they stay on standby and not venture too far from Paris during the holidays. Hasn't gone down too well with some of them, though. The misery of everyone who's got to work over Christmas. RT.com, our app, Facebook, our YouTube channel, many ways to keep up to speed with the news from us at RT International. Before I go, still a moment for me, Kevin Owen, to wish you all the best seasonal greetings and all the best, of course, for 2018. Hope you continue to watch us in the coming 12 months.
С Новым годом! А прочти-ка мне стихотворение.
Я узнал, что у меня есть огромная семья. И топика, лесок, в пол колесок.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard.
Los Angeles, the city of luxury and fame, but also an alarming number of people living in the streets.
The simple fact in LA is there's just not enough shelter. Even if people on the streets right now decided to come in, there's nowhere to come in.
It's been a struggle, but I'm hanging in there.
This man found his own response to the problem and constructed dozens of tiny homes for people in need of shelter.
When you have nothing and nowhere to go, having something like this may as well be a castle.
But do the authorities accept such solution?
A tiny house on a city parking space is not a solution. You have to have someone monitoring the site. Otherwise, it'll be a free-for-all.
And is there a better alternative to end the homelessness crisis?
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. President Donald Trump's 2017 National Security Strategy report tells us how he sees the world, or rather, how the Washington foreign policy leads to. For a candidate who ran on a message of change, the report is unremarkable in its defense of status quo policies and views. Clearly, Washington's neocons are running the show. Cross-talking national security strategy. I'm joined by my guest in Washington, Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we have Brian Becker. He is the director of the Answer Coalition, as well as host of Loud and Clear, a daily news show on Radio Sputnik. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Brian, let me go to you first. I'll be quite blunt. I mean, I read it quite carefully. It seems more or less a continuation of what we've seen for almost the last 30 years. It actually seems a lot more confrontational, I would say. Some of the points about trade, I actually agree with. On immigration, I actually agree with. But more or less the same. You know, the people that wrote the 2017 report could have written the one to justifying the Iraq War. If you actually compare texts, they're very similar in the words they use. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Iraq War, because the National Security Strategy, which is a congressionally mandated report from the executive branch, it sometimes is a predictor of what's coming. In the case of George W. Bush, 6 months before the invasion, the shock and awe invasion of Iraq, Bush came out with the National Security Strategy, which provided, although he didn't use the exact words of preemptive war, it was the logic of preemptive war. In other words, the U.S. arrogating to itself the right to perceive threats and go to war against them even before the U.S. has been attacked. Of course, that would be a violation of the UN Charter and international law, but nonetheless, it became a powerful, logical explanation for what came later. The question now with Donald Trump's national security strategy is, does this predict where Trump is really going? And I think it does. I mean, he mentioned China 24 times. The report mentions China 24 times, all of them in a bellicose, aggressive way. It mentions Russia in a bellicose and aggressive way. There's no kind words for either China or Russia. Iraq and North Korea are rogue states. And of course, non-state actors. Terrorism is the third dimension of the threat to America. And so you have the Trump administration sort of bringing together the America First or overarching sort of agitprop of the Trump election campaign with this idea that the rise of China or the reemergence of Russia now back on its feet means that America is receding, that America is being humbled, that America is the victim, that America is threatened. And so I think what Trump has actually done is articulate not just the possibility of a new Cold War, but the logic of a new Cold War. And thus it becomes almost official in Washington, and things will follow from that.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting takeaway. Mike, what was your reaction to it? Because it was over a year ago, I think it was, when we still had candidate Trump, and he was in the national interest, I think his article was. I mean, this principled realism. I still don't see anything principled, and I don't see any really realism in it here. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, Peter. Nice to be with you. I agree with some of what Brian just said. I do think that there is a tone in the report that is strong and that tries to push back and that pushes back strongly against China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I agree with all that. I do, however, and by the way, you're aware I'm not a supporter of President Trump, and I never was, but I know who he is, and I know why he got elected. And the putting America first concept, if I could just begin with that in my first comment, because that is the centerpiece of the opening page and I think the title of the report, or at least the subtitle. And I think, frankly, the way in which that concept is described is basically okay. Now, I share some of your and Brian's concerns about the tone towards certain countries. We can come back to that. But putting America first, of course, can be interpreted